Greetings, Internet. I wasn't expecting you to be here so late. So, I was inspired by the topic of today's video, a certain story by R.L. Stine. I believe the title is Stay Out of the Basement. It's the one involving evil, shall we say, plant life. And, well, because of that, I took it upon myself to start my own little garden, and the buds are really taking well to the Miracle Grow that I've been giving them. And, well, let's just say it's been a rather lively crop this year. So, with that said, ladies, gentlemen, boys, ghouls, and all other configurations of being, let's move on to today's video. And for goodness sakes, stay out of the basement. Whew. Okay. Well, greetings, friendos, and welcome back to the Oxlayer. Now, if this happens to be your first of this particular series of videos, then you may be asking yourself what it is exactly we're going to be doing here today. To answer that question, you'll need to look no further than the title down below to see that I'll be taking a look back at the writings of author R.L. Stine, along with the television series based off of his works, just to see how much these things differ and how close they are to being the same. Also, I should specify that we will only be taking a look at the episodes that were originally released on VHS, and in the order in which they were released back in the day. Now, without further delay, let's get into this week's episode. If it wasn't already obvious from that garish intro and the fact that I've been flaunting it in front of you, we will be taking a look at Stay Out of the Basement, which, according to my research, was the second episode released in this format by Fox Home Entertainment. For starters, as we did with the last one, The Haunted Mask, we will be taking a look at the characters as they're described in the book compared to their on-screen counterparts. Margaret Brewer. In the book, she is described as being tall and thin, with straight brown hair, brown eyes, and dark colouring. The Margaret from the episode. She appears to be tall and thin like she is in the book. Her hair is brown, just like in the book, but is wavy instead of being straight, and her eyes are green. She's fairly pale compared to the, quote, dark colouring her page-based counterpart has. Casey Brewer. The book says that he has straight blonde hair, his complexion is pale. It also mentions that he has freckles and pale blue eyes. In the episode, here he's got brown hair. He's still a bit pale, but is lacking the freckles he's described as having, but he retains the blue eyes as described in the book. Dr. Brewer. Casey and Margaret's father is only said to be tall and thin in the book. The Dr. Brewer from the episode has brown hair and blue eyes. He's not quite as tall as his book counterpart makes him out to be, but he is pretty thin, just as he is described in the book. Mrs. Brewer is said to have straight brown hair, brown eyes, and is described as having a, quote, dark colouring. The Mrs. Brewer from the episode. Here she's got wavy brown, almost black-looking hair, and seems to be a bit fairer-skinned than the, quote, dark colouring the book describes her as having. Diane Manning. In the novel, it says that she has long red hair and emerald green eyes. The Diane in the episode doesn't need a description, as she wasn't in the episode regardless. Mr. Martinez, in the book, is described as being a quiet little man with a tanned bald head and a brown moustache. The Mr. Martinez from the episode, renamed Dr. Merrick, he's mostly clean-shaven here, aside from a bit of 5 o'clock shadow. He has a full head of black curly hair, and seems to be a bit taller than Dr. Brewer. Okay, that does it for descriptions. Sorry if it seemed a little lacking, but for some reason Mr. Stein just didn't put a whole lot of characteristics into the novel. With that out of the way, let's move on to the story. In the book, the story goes that Margaret Brewer and her brother Casey live with their parents, who go unnamed aside from being referred to as Dr. Brewer and Mrs. Brewer, in California. Their father is a botanist who was recently fired from his job at Polytech. Ever since he was let go, he has been spending more and more time in his basement laboratory. Their mother winds up having to leave for Tucson after she gets a phone call informing her that her sister Eleanor isn't doing well. After she leaves, Dr. Brewer starts behaving even more strangely and spending more and more of his time in the basement than ever before. Over time, the two kids witness some bizarre things, such as Dr. Brewer bleeding green goo from a wound in his arm, him eating a bag of plant food, and leaves suddenly growing from his bald head, and his bed being filled with dirt and bugs. Early on in the book, the two are told to stay out of the basement by their father, but obviously they don't, and upon entering they find that he's growing a lot of strange plants. Plants that seem to move. Plants that seem to breathe. This obviously freaks them out, and their father, who was initially irate the first time they attempted to go into the basement, seems to relent and tells them that he will explain everything to them soon, and promises that he will show them what he's been working on. This seems to satisfy their curiosity and to put their worries to rest for a bit. Until, of course, they notice the changes in his behavior and witness the physical changes mentioned previously. Meanwhile, we find out through Margaret's friend, Diane Manning, that the reason why their father was let go from his job was because of his experiments. Apparently, they got a little out of control, and he refused to stop them. But it isn't exactly said what those experiments were. As time goes by, Margaret starts to become more and more suspicious and curious about what their dad is doing in the basement. Meanwhile, he's been able to quiet their curiosity to an extent. The story reaches its climax when Dr. Brewer goes to the airport to pick up their mother. The duo go down into the basement again to get their kites and make some disturbing discoveries. They wind up finding the wallet of their father's former employer, only referred to as Mr. Martinez, hidden away on a shelf. The man in question had stopped by for a visit the day prior and had disappeared. Then the two hear a mysterious thudding and banging sound coming suddenly from the supply closet, which now has a lock and a 2x4 nailed across its door. Thinking that those sounds could be coming from the missing Mr. Martinez, Margaret and Casey manage to get the door open and discover some of their father's experiments on the shelves within the closet. They find numerous plants with faces, malformed limbs, and other abominations wheezing and sighing inside. At first, the duo nearly runs off, horrified at the discovery, but then Margaret notices a pair of feet sticking out from further inside the room. She pushes past the abominable plants and discovers their father. Another father. This one also has leaves growing from his scalp. Margaret wants to untie him immediately, but Casey doesn't trust him. So they remove the tape from his mouth, and he tells them that the father they've been interacting with this whole time has been a plant clone. He also pleads with them to untie him. Eventually they do so, only after he reveals that Dr. Martinez is in there as well. Once they get him loose, though, he starts acting odd and goes to get an axe. He comes back over to them with the axe in his hands, and they start freaking out just as someone is heard coming down the basement stairs. They witness the other Dr. Brewer come into the basement with their mother, who understandably starts to freak out upon seeing this other version of her husband, who is holding an axe. In the confusion, Margaret manages to get the axe away from him and holds the pair of Dr. Brewers at bay, while she has Casey go and get her a knife. She then takes the knife when he brings it to her and stabs the Dr. Brewer from the closet in the arm. When he bleeds red, she knows this is her real father and gives him back the axe, which he promptly uses to chop down the imposter. After this, we get the full story behind what happened that caused all of this mess. It turns out that he had been doing experiments using electricity to splice the DNA from different plants together to create a super plant, if you will. Well, one day while working, he wound up cutting himself and didn't realize that some of his blood had gotten onto the slide along with the DNA. And of course, his blood wound up mixing with the DNA. He was astonished by the result and wound up continuing his work in secret until he wound up creating a near-perfect clone of himself. The resulting creature overpowered him, tied him up and locked him away along with his failed experiments, and assumed his identity, taking over his life. After explaining all of this, he vows to destroy the majority of the plants he created to end their suffering, and says that he will be planting the few that he can save in their backyard. He also explains the leaves growing from his head were apparently part of the... oh, how do I word it? When he cut himself, some of that plant matter had gotten into the wound, and when he used the DNA splicer, it had infused him with some minor plant qualities, causing him to lose his hair overnight and the leaves to sprout. He reassures them that he should be back to normal soon, and points out that the leaves are already starting to fall out. Then over the course of the next few days, he follows up on his vow to destroy the plants he had engineered, and burns them in a big bonfire. He also plants the ones he was able to salvage in their backyard. The story ends with Margaret standing alone behind the house, and a little yellow flower nudging at her ankle and starting to beg for help and claiming to be her real father. Now that's it for the story from the book. With that out of the way, let's take a look at the episode, shall we? The episode's story starts off with Margaret walking out to the car with their mother, who is leaving to visit her sick sister. Margaret starts complaining about being worried about their father, saying that he doesn't have time for her anymore. The two get interrupted when Casey rushes up to their mother to give her a card he had gotten for the sickly Aunt Eleanor. Margaret goes right back to complaining about how busy their father has been ever since he lost his job. Mrs. Brewer reminds her that he's just trying to prove to the university that they made a mistake when they let him go. She says this and then asks them to look after him while she's away, and then tells them to go and get him for her, as she doesn't want to be late for her plane. They say their goodbyes, and the kids head inside to get their father. They make it to the basement door and knock, but he doesn't seem to hear it, so they start to make their way down. When they've gotten only about halfway down, he appears at the top of the stairs and yells down for them to stay out of the basement!
Suspicious.
They come back up and he apologizes for yelling and asks them to walk him outside before going over to grab his coat. With his coat in hand, he cautions them again about not going down into the basement. He leaves and takes their mother to the airport, leaving them home alone. The two are relaxing in the living room, Casey playing a video game and Margaret fiddling with some pink gadget. Well, folks, I've done some digging, and it turns out that the pink gadget in question is a device known as Dear Diary, which was made by Tiger Toys around 1994 or 1995. And on a mostly unrelated note, R.L. Stine would go on to write a book for his The Nightmare Room series, which was called Dear Diary, I'm Dead, around the year 2000. So in a very roundabout way, I guess that came full circle. Anyways, she hears something and turns off the TV. With the television turned off, now Casey is able to hear it too. The sounds seem to be coming from the basement, and after some brief hesitation from Casey, the two head down to check it out. Once down there, Casey starts complaining about the heat and winds up taking off his sweatshirt to try and cool himself back down. They look around for a bit, and one of the plants in the lab reaches out with a vine and grabs a hold of Margaret's arm. She pulls free just before Casey comes over to check on her. Meanwhile, their father shows back up and honks the car's horn. They hear this and race back upstairs. They breathe a momentary sigh of relief before Casey remembers that his sweatshirt is still down there. He quickly heads back down for it, managing to find it, and darts back up the stairs just in time. But then they both confess to having been down there anyways after he asks them about it.
Did you go into the basement?
Yes.
We didn't touch anything.
I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry.
Kids okay?
He then offers to explain what it is that he's been doing and tells them a little bit about his experiments before cutting it short. Telling them that he needs to head back down, he hurries off and leaves them alone in the kitchen.
Suspicious.
The next morning, Margaret makes him some breakfast, but he doesn't come up to eat. His plate of food being left on the table even hours later. Eventually, he emerges from the basement, and Margaret finds him in the kitchen eating plant food. He then chugs a pitcher of water before heading back down. Later, she's on the phone with her mother and is telling her about what's been happening, along with the plant food feast she had witnessed her father having. While she's talking, he sneaks up behind her and snatches the phone away. He starts talking to the mother for a bit before ending the call and hanging up the phone. Margaret remarks that she hopes that Aunt Eleanor starts feeling better soon. He just stares at her coldly for a moment before walking away. I don't know about you all, but this seems pretty sus to me. Just saying. That night, she gets awakened by strange sounds, and when she goes to investigate, she finds her father cleaning a wound on his arm that seems to be oozing green slime. She also sees that he's growing leaves out of the top of his head. He almost catches her spying, but she manages to make it back to her room and pretends to be asleep until he leaves. The next day, she sneaks into Casey's room and tells him about what she saw. He doesn't believe her, and shortly after, their father calls them both down for breakfast. In the kitchen, when Margaret confronts him about the leaves and the goop from his arm, he confesses that they are side effects from his experiments, and that they should go away soon. Then he serves them up some of the breakfast he made, which looks a lot like creamed spinach and apparently smells bad. Before Casey or Margaret can be forced to eat any of this, the doorbell rings, and their father goes to answer it. But not before telling them that he expects their bowls to be empty by the time he returns. As soon as he's gone from the room, they dump the gross glop into the garbage. It turns out that the person at the door who had been ringing the doorbell was in fact Dr. Merrick from the university their father had been working for. It turns out that he had dropped by to have a look at Dr. Brewer's work. Before Dr. Brewer can stop him, Merrick starts heading down to the basement. Casey and Margaret are told to go outside and play by their father before he heads down as well. While the two are outside, Casey hears them arguing. Then he gets attacked by a vine. Margaret hears him struggling and comes over to help. Then he and Margaret manage to fight off the plant. Just as Casey starts telling her about the fight he had overheard, their father comes up behind them and accuses them of spying. Despite their protests, he sends them to their rooms and heads back down into the lab once again. That night, they are awoken by the sound of drilling and come back down to find their old man adding locks to the basement door. He informs them that he's also barred the windows down there so that they can't go snooping around his lab anymore. He then says that he's going to leave for a few hours and gives them a glare before heading out.
Suspicious.
Margaret gets the idea to call their mother, but the piece of paper with their aunt's number on it is missing all of a sudden. They go to their parents' bedroom to look for it, and while they're looking, the phone begins to ring. They decide to let the answering machine get it, and it turns out to have been Dr. Merrick's wife. Through her message, she confirms Margaret's suspicions that he hadn't left earlier, even though their father had told them that he indeed had gone. Shortly after this, Dr. Brewer returns, and the two are almost caught when Margaret stumbles and causes the answering machine to begin playing. She's able to shut off the machine as Casey heads out into the hall and intercepts their father on the way to the room. At this point, we find out that the reason why he came back so soon is that he had forgotten something in the house. Then he tells Casey to go back to bed before heading into the room to get whatever it was that he needed. Margaret is currently hiding beneath the bed. He gets what he was looking for, but not before she witnessed several worms falling off of the bed, along with Dr. Merrick's wallet, which the old man had dropped for a moment before reaching down to pick it back up.
Suspicious. Bad.
He leaves and Casey bursts into the room to check on her. She tells him about what she saw, and then, after noticing the blankets moving, they pull the covers off of the bed and find that it's covered with dirt and worms. Then they decide to go into the basement for answers, but not before arming themselves with a sprayer of weed killer. After having pried the lock off of the door, they head back down and make their way through the now jungle-like basement. They discover Dr. Merrick's belongings near the closet where they had heard the knocking previously. They get the closet door open to find their father, another of their father, tied up and gagged inside. They remove the gag, and he informs them that the other father that they've been living with is actually a plant.
It would appear to me that there's an impostor in their midst.
They untie him. He then picks up a crowbar and starts acting strangely. Soon after, the other Dr. Brewer shows up, and they start to argue back and forth about which one is the real one. All the while, Casey is threatening the both of them with the weed killer. Margaret takes it from him and starts pointing it at both of them herself. At this point, one of them calls her Princess, which is a nickname of hers that only her father ever called her, and she sprays the other Dr. Brewer, causing him to liquefy and perish. We then jump forward to Dr. Brewer and Dr. Merrick putting some plants into the bed of a truck. Dr. Merrick thanking Dr. Brewer for rescuing him and asking him when he'll return now that he's being given his old job back. Dr. Brewer informs him that he'll be back once he's over all of the side effects of his experiments. He also says that Dr. Merrick should really be thanking Casey and Margaret, who we now cut to along with their mother. Margaret comes over and makes a comment about not understanding how the whole thing started, and he explains that he had cut his hand on one of the slides of plant molecules he had been using for his experiments, and that his blood got mixed in, which led to the creation of a plant that was part human. He goes on to say that he continued with his work until he went too far and wound up with a plant copy of himself. They talk some more, and then Dr. Merrick leaves and the rest of the family head inside to start working on their dinner. Margaret stays behind to tie her shoe, and some flowers start talking to her, claiming to be her real father, before she bolts up the porch steps and the episode ends.
Margaret, help me. Please help me. I'm your father. I'm your real father.
Oh, I'm your father.
No, I'm your father.
I'm your father.
I'm your father. No, I'm your father. No, he isn't. I'm your father.
Well, folks, what were your thoughts on this one? I personally thought that it was a pretty good retelling of the story, and I believe that it holds up fairly well alongside its book counterpart. Don't get me wrong, it has its flaws. Case in point, let's take a look at the scene where Margaret figures out which Dr. Brewer is her real father, starting with the book. Here she figures this out by stabbing the one she suspects of being her real father in the arm with a knife. When she sees him bleeding red, she knows immediately that this is her real father and gives him the axe that she had taken from him before. That axe he then uses to chop down the other Brewer, and it's shown that his insides are thick and fibrous like the stem of a plant. Which makes sense, since he would be part plant, and the idea of checking the blood, given that she saw the imposter bleeding green, was a clever touch. In the episode, she's only able to figure out which one is the real one when he calls her princess. Then she douses the imposter with weed killer. The fact that there was any conflict here, any conflict at all, considering that her real father would have still been a flesh and blood human who wouldn't really have been affected by the weed killer, and the imposter is a plant who would be affected by the weed killer, it's kind of odd here. I mean, was the real Dr. Brewer worried because a little bit of foliage that was growing out of his head? Was he afraid that he had become more plant than human at this point? Or could it be that the other Brewer was doing something to him off-screen that was causing him to change? Well, these questions may never be answered, but this is just one scene that doesn't really seem to work when you start applying logic to it. Regardless, I have to say that this one gets a pass from me. I don't think it's the strongest of the episodes, but it gets the job done. It's got its clever little spooks and things to help keep you on the edge of your seat for the entirety. Now then, everyone, thank you all so much from the bottom of my cold black little heart for tuning in again. It means so much that you're willing to put up with a decrepit old coot like me prattling on about some wayward nostalgia each week. Anyways, with all of that Halloween hubbub out of the way, this is your old buddy Oktoberfest saying, YouTube viewers beware, subscribe if you dare.